Inside this box right here is the Jitsie Hybrid bike. It's a 24-inch bike that's a combination of some competition geometry as well as street geometry. Every time I mention this bike to anyone, they always respond with the same thing. I've always wanted to know about that bike. And today we're gonna break it out and figure out what this bike is all about. So the thing that makes this bike kind of interesting is that this bike looks like a competition bike with just a seat attached to it. But when you look into the geometry of the bike, there's quite a bit different from both bikes. It's really just kind of split right down the middle. I just opened the top of the box and it reminded me to give a shout out to Trial Superstore for sending us this bike to test. But what's also pretty cool is when you buy stuff from Trial Superstore, they send you Super Rider stickers as well. So the bonus about this unboxing in particular is that my friend Travis actually bought this bike and he rides with me on a pretty regular basis. If you saw the guy who was riding the GT mod bike in here last week, he's now finally upgrading to this bike. So not only are we gonna unbox this, do a first ride, but you're gonna start seeing this bike in a lot of other videos. And so we'll get a bit more of a long-term view on this one, which I think is really important because every other bike is really straightforward, but when it comes to this hybrid comp and street style, we don't really know what we're working with yet. So I feel like it's best that we have a long time to really dig into this bike and see what it's all about. Here comes the moment of truth. Before we really dig into this unboxing, there's a couple little details I want to share. So this bike cost $1,575, which as far as bikes go for trials, it's not a bad place to start. And that's a big reason why people have wanted to know about this bike and have wanted to try this bike, because it's a really affordable trials bike that gives you options to ride both street and comp style. So it's kind of a double whammy, do everything bike that's at a really affordable price point. So as we put this thing together, we're gonna figure out why the price point is what it is. And hopefully we're gonna find out that the geometry actually works and is going to not only be good for street trials, but also competition trials. We're definitely gonna have to put this bike through the ringer. So I'm gonna remove some packaging and then we're gonna get this thing into the stand as quickly as possible so we can get it going. This bike came together pretty easy. And so what I'm gonna do now is take you from the front of the bike to the back of the bike and show you some of the elements that are on the bike. One thing I wanna say before we dig into the bike and all the different components in it is that this bike is at a completely different price point than most of the bikes that we ride. Of course, the Inspired Hex Team that I ride or the Kruger's Jealousy are quite a bit more expensive. But I think what Jitsie was trying to do with this bike in particular was make a bike that anybody could enter the sport of trials and figure out which direction they were gonna go. So they've offered up some street elements, they've offered up some comp elements, and they've tried to do the components on the bike in a way that will hold up to those things, but not overprice the bike where somebody is not gonna be able to pick it up and get indoor sport. This is definitely a starter bike for someone who is getting into trials, who's just learning to pedal kick, who's just starting to ride up on stuff. I really think that you could add different components to this to bring it up to a much higher level and be able to do quite a bit with this bike. But now that I'm looking at it here, I think this is a great starter bike that I would put just about anybody on to get the ball rolling when it comes to trials. Now the good news is that even though this bike is at a lower price point, Jitsie's done stuff right. So for example, the handlebars here, 100mm rise. That's great. That's gonna help whoever rides this bike be able to have lots of control over the bike, lift the front wheel up. This is actually a higher rise bar than I have on any of my bikes, and that's great. This is gonna help any beginner rider get started. They do have these Shimano disc brakes, which I've never actually ridden before. This will be kind of curious to test these out. Again, because it's not the highest price point, you're not gonna get a set of Magura MT7s on here, but let's see how these actually work. The stem on this bike is 120mm by 35-degree rise. So you're basically splitting the difference when it comes to stems. On a comp bike, you'd have a longer stem, but it would usually be a little bit flatter. So on this bike, you've got something with a little bit more of a rise to it. And of course, when it comes to frame design, Jitsie usually cuts out the front of their head tube, and they did just the same on this bike to drop just a little bit extra weight. Kind of a cool feature, I guess. Have a look at the tread pattern on this Kenda K-Rad tire. It has the same tires front and back. This is a 24-inch by 2.3 Kenda K-Rad. These are kind of tried and tested dirt jump tires. I've seen these for years. They're not the craziest sidewalls, but for riding park and street and dirt and all that stuff, they work just fine. I've got to say I'm pretty happy with the drivetrain of this bike. So you've got your Jitsie cranks here, you've got their bash ring, and you've got a front freewheel on here with a KMC chain. This is an area where they could have saved money when they made this bike, but they actually did all the things that normally go on every other Jitsie bike. So I'm happy that they stuck with this because ultimately, other than the frame, this part's kind of the most important when it comes to getting on a trials bike and making it work. So you've got good engagement on this front freewheel, you've got a nice strong chain, proper here. One thing about this bike that I don't totally love, and actually this is a whole Jitsie thing, is that they rely on these snail cams to tension the chain. So especially because this bike is for beginner riders who are not going to be as fluent in working on trials bikes and getting everything just right, I would have rather seen them put more of a pulley style chain tensioner on here instead of this snail cam. Snail cams have been around since like the 80s, and I just don't think they're that great. I really think the pulley style works better for everyone, but Jitsie seems to disagree with me on this point. One thing that I think is kind of clever about this bike is how they dealt with the seat, because obviously street riding, you want to have a seat on your bike, but a lot of competition riders don't have seats on their bike. So how best to remove the seat without having a whole lot of change to the frame? So what Jitsie did, they did a pivotal seat where the whole way that the seat and the seat post is attached to the bike is actually on the top here. So there's one bolt here that secures it down here, and all you have to do is undo this bolt and the whole thing comes off. Check this out. The last thing we should talk about before we weigh this bike and get it all dialed in is the geometry of the bike itself. So really what they've done when it comes to looking at the geometry of this bike is they've more or less split the difference when it comes to comp and street geometry. For example, the wheelbase of this bike is 1045. A competition wheelbase is anywhere between like 1070 to 1085 millimeters. And the bottom bracket here is raised up to plus 50. My competition bike has a plus 70, and Jitsie's competition is like a plus 85. So it has a little bit higher bottom bracket, but it's not all the way street. I think my street bike has got like a plus 25, so it's right down the middle. I think that's why everyone's so curious about this bike, because they took some elements from street trials, they took some elements from competition trials, and they melded it all together to make this bike. You know, after talking about putting street and competition geometry together, the one thing that I didn't consider was where to put my bars. Should I roll them forward, competition style? Should I roll them straight up? I have no idea where to even start with this one. This is probably what's going to take the most amount of figuring out to decide what you should do with your handlebars to make this bike work the best for you. But ultimately, I think you'll probably end up deciding when you start to see what kind of riding style you prefer the most. So if you really start riding this without a seat and you're really enjoying being up on the back wheel, the bars are going to come forward a little bit. If you're bunny hopping this bike a lot and doing manuals and stuff, they're probably going to come straight up. But this is probably where you're going to make the most change on this bike. I think for testing purposes, we'll kind of split the difference. Now the real moment of truth. Let's put this bike up here and see how much it weighs. 21.1 pounds or 9.57 kilos. That's pretty light for this bike. There's really no excuse when it comes to riding this bike. It's not too heavy, the parts are all pretty decent. Overall, you've got everything you need to start riding trials. Well, I did a little quick ride on this bike, but there's nothing camera worthy on it because these brakes are definitely not broken in. So I'm gonna have to save that for a first ride video that we'll be doing very soon. And in the meantime, if you're buying this bike because you're getting into trials, go check out this video right here, which is the first 5 things you'll learn in trials. I bet you can do most, if not all of it, on the bike that you're riding right now.